All right, guys, today we've got a special video planned, and I'm super excited to finally be getting around to making this because I've been meaning to do this for a while, but, you know, I don't know, like, the time didn't really feel right until about now. Like, this year's getting pretty hype, and I'm really excited for it. So today, what I'm going to be sharing with you all is the history of my friends and I's fantasy football league, 19 Eyebrows. Now, if you've been around in my stream chat before, you've probably heard me and my friends talking about fantasy football on and off, like, throughout the year. And I know some of you have also chimed in on the conversation. We've had some good talks, some Raiders fans, some Broncos fans, you know, some real passionate football viewers out there. I love to see it, you know. I love to be sharing all this stuff, the drama, the hype around our league and stuff like that. This series is kind of just going to focus on documenting all of this stuff because we've had a lot of really interesting moments throughout the years. You know, this league goes all the way back to 2014, and most of the members of our league have been around for its entirety. And it's just, you know, it's just good old fucking fantasy football. I mean, I think it's really cool to be able to look back at all the big moments that we've had, ups and downs with each person's team over the years. This will be a place where you guys can get in on the drama and we can keep track of it for ourselves and look back on. So for right now, this video is going to be focused on just all of the notable events that have happened throughout the last 8 or 9 years in this league. This league was actually started in 2014. We're just going to be covering today all of the notable highs and notable lows of each of our owners, their big wins, big losses, big trades that have happened over the years, everybody's win record and stuff like that. We're all going to be covering that so that you guys can have a little more context going into this season, seeing what happens with us week to week. So be sure to check back week to week and see how some of your favorite owners might be doing today. But without further ado, I'm about to introduce you to everyone and everything notable that's happened to all of us in the last 9 years of this. So we're going to kick this off by introducing all of our current active league members and just showing you their team names this season along with it. So rapid fire right here. We got B-Mags' team, Philip the Peacock. Got Jason's team, the New York Frankies. Connor's team, Bluestown Jimmy Bez Band. It's kind of it's a long story. We got Zach's team, Meatcock. Very aggressive. Yeah, very aggressive team name, that's for sure. Graham's team, Morning Woodhead, paying homage to Danny Woodhead, the OG fantasy football PPR legend. Jack's team, and now Jack is officially our league commissioner since day one commish. And I'd say we're all pretty satisfied thus far with his management overall, but his team name is, yes, that type of commissioner, yes. BBQ's team, My Kicker is Gay, and hey, why don't you come and meet his kicker? Jamie's team, No Connie Johnny, with Elastigirl as the profile pick. I think, I don't know. I just find it interesting that those two things are paired together. And then we've got Fat Clam on My Face with Shane's team. And there's someone's name censored out at the front of this team name. And we're not showing it here because we respect privacy. And, you know, it just so happens to be another league owner's mother. Yeah, and that's all I'll say. And fuck Shane. And last but not least, we have the greatest team in league history. My team, of course. A team has no mercy. The A-team, if you will. Yeah, the profile photo and the team name is kind of a long story, but that's what you guys are here for. We're here to get you caught up, so let's get on with it. Okay, for starters, why is our league called 19 Eyebrows? Well, you see, it's been the same name since the beginning, and the thing is, if you look at one of our current members over here, B-Mags, you look at these photos of him back in the day, he had something going on with one of his eyebrows, like it just kind of like had some hair missing from it, or I don't even know. But like we would always give him shit and like, you know, bully him for like having one eyebrow, missing an eyebrow, shit like that. So, you know, when we made our fantasy league, we figured we'd just bully him some more and, you know, count all the eyebrows of each owner in the league. So 19 eyebrows represents the number of eyebrows brought to the table in our league. However, in year one of our fantasy football league, there was only 15 eyebrows, and these eyebrows weren't even included. So looking back at the seminal season of our coveted fantasy league, you can see that the commissioner finished out on top. And this has become somewhat of a meme within our league because it doesn't count. We don't officially regard this as a championship win in the modern era, if you will. You know, this is like before Christ era of our league over here, man. You know, this is just when it was the Wild West and we didn't really know whose teams were going to stick around for the long haul. Like I said, I wasn't even added to the league at this point. Some other members, plenty of them as well. And only half of this league is comprised of current, you know, still standing members. So if we were to stack this championship up next to a lot of the other ones that have come through in the years, this is definitely the weakest, the most questionable, the biggest asterisk, and not officially recognized by the modern era of our league. Officially, many of us owners today have been quoted saying that at best we count this as a half ring, you know, 0.5 of a ring. If we take a closer look at the standings over here, there isn't too much notable other than, well, Jason's team back then used to be called the Chicago Black Bears. This was actually one of his better seasons. I mean, good for Jason here. And Zach's team prior to being Meatcock was simply Team Lalu. Hernandez Hitmen belonged to one of the early owners in the league, Travis, who in the end didn't last too many seasons after this. Team Cam over near the bottom. This was a one and done year for Cam. He wasn't really up to snuff with the other owners. He couldn't really keep up, but he did manage to outscore Jamie down at the bottom, who Jamie was an original first-year member with his Notre Dame New York Jets. That'll tell you pretty much all you need to know about the teams Jamie roots for outside of fantasy. I'd say probably overall the most notable thing to happen this season was Team Cam over down at the bottom of the standings traded Calvin Johnson to the Chicago Black Bears for a defense. Yes, that's Calvin Johnson, current Hall of Famer, traded for a defense in the middle of his prime. Other notable receivers to break out this year as rookies, too, worth mentioning. Mike Evans, Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry, Sammy Watkins, just to name a few. It was a big year for receivers to break out. That's about all that's really noteworthy about the 2014 season in our league, and just like based off of some of the things I've already shared with you, it was clearly a lackluster season and not quite the impressive championship win by the commish. All right, so moving on to next year. This season is where I could actually start to look at some more detailed stats, which is a pretty good thing because looking back at this, I didn't realize it at first, but this is a surprisingly notable year. A lot definitely went down. And right off the bat, you can see just from looking at the standings, there's been a big shakeup. And this actually is one of the few early years where it's nearly completely, with the exception of Mike at the top, it's all current members in this year. And still only 8 teams, only 15 eyebrows. But like I said, a lot actually went down here. So in an attempt to make the league more competitive, Travis and Cam were out, and myself and Mike were in. And I gotta be honest, like Mike showed some serious big dick energy, winning it all in the first year, like absolutely schooling all current league members in his very first year entering the league. To go down the list, just so you guys can get some context, my ball, Zach Ertz, would be Zach's team at the time. 6th round, 199th overall was Mags's team. That's the previous name for Peacock. And Brian's team the year before was, he was the BMS Mountain Goats. This year, he ended up with Team Burquez because, I don't know, the way the management works, we were moving around some teams and the way that owning an account on the team works, I don't know, it's complicated. He's Team Burquez now, deal with it. Jason changed his name from Chicago Black Bears to the New York Frankies, the name that he still holds today. And my account was inserted to take over Cam's team, so I inherited Cam's bad first season record. And given that my quarterback this season for most of the year ended up being Blake Bortles, the only good year he was a top 10 fantasy QB, we went all out with the franchise. We just ran with the whole Blake Bottles thing. The Blake Bottles was apparently a thing back then, and that's what I had. Commissioner is the same deal, and Jamie's team was changed to Proises Playhouse, and this was to honor CJ Proises, who was a rookie at the time out of Notre Dame that Jamie was just a huge fanboy of. It's a long story, But yeah, Jamie was big on this running back, and he didn't really pan out in the end for him. For starters, the biggest and most notable thing about this season was we actually decided to draft in July, and that turned out to be a massive mistake that we would never repeat. Because from July to September, there's a lot that goes on within preseason, OTAs, all sorts of stuff. And injuries can sometimes happen, like sometimes very serious ones. Now, when we get to some of the later seasons, I'll be able to show you people's teams from week to week, all the way back to week 1. But the story goes like this. So it's 2015 preseason, and Jack gets a text very early in the afternoon from his dad warning him that Jordy Nelson might have just torn his ACL in the preseason at practice or something like that. Now, in 2015, Jordy Nelson was a consensus top 10 wide receiver, and he was Aaron Rodgers' favorite wide receiver at the time. So he was definitely going to have a monster season and be the type of player that could carry your entire roster. Now, the commissioner, being the asshole that he is, immediately offered a trade for Dez Bryant with Zach. Now, I can't go back with this far back into the league. I can't go back and check this year's individual trades directly, but the trade obviously involved some other people, and Jack just balanced the trade so that Zach was getting a really good deal on Jordy. Zach took the bait, and a few hours later found out, oh shit, I just got burned and totally hustled by Jack. So Zach immediately put in an offer to trade Jordy Nelson for Justin Forsett off of Mags' team now. All of this taking place within a few hours on a random day in the middle of preseason. And it just so happened that when Zach offered the trade, Mags was at the middle of a Red Sox game at Fenway Park and wasn't really paying too much attention to everything that was going on or what anyone was saying in our group chats. So Mags took Zach's offer and essentially just threw away one of the top 10 running backs in football for a player who tore his ACL and had a season-ending injury before he even played a game. Jordy Nelson would go on to not even play in 2015 at all. Now, as much as this was dramatic in the heat of the moment, ironically, karma would come to bite everyone in the ass at the end of the season. Dez Bryant on Jack's team would only play about 2 or 3 games before getting his own season-ending injury, and Justin Forsett would do pretty well for most of the year and perform at the level everyone expected, but he suffered an injury towards the back half of the season that really held back Zach's team during the playoffs. And of all things this season, the playoffs were probably the most interesting part. So you see, aside from last year, this most recent past season, this was by far BBQ's best season. This was his shot to win it all this year. It was gonna happen this year. BBQ killed it on the waiver wire early in the year and landed Larry Fitzgerald right in the middle of his big, you could call it a renaissance in his career, because he was underperforming for the previous few years and suddenly was just going off with Carson Palmer on the team now. Meanwhile, he was also able to hustle Mags out of a trade for Demaryius Thomas, which he paired with one of his top picks in Calvin Johnson. But the nail in the coffin that had BBQ destined for a fantasy football championship this season was when he landed Devonta Freeman off of waivers. Devonta Freeman actually fucked around and became the #1 ranked running back at the end of the season. And he finished the year at the time with a crazy 303 points. So BBQ was a powerhouse leading the standings going into the playoffs at just 10-2-1. But unfortunately for BBQ, as what would usually happen for years to come for his first round in the playoffs, as soon as BBQ had to play his first game, his team just quits on him. I don't know what happens, but he always is out of the playoffs pretty much his first game. This past season was actually the first time ever he was able to make it past the first round, which is pretty crazy looking back at some of the teams. The real storybook dream team playoff run came from Mike the minute he actually made it into the playoffs. Mike, being a first-year owner at the time like myself, had a lot to prove, and he was able to slide in at the wild card spot and run the table all the way for the championship in just his first year with the league. He had the second worst record going into the playoff, and he made it through every team until he ended up facing Zach in the Super Bowl, where he managed to win by literally just 1 point. What you gotta understand that's most impressive about this run is, not to spoil anything as we get into the later years of the league, but Mike is no longer a current member of the league, and yet he still manages to have more rings than more than half of our league's members, despite not even being in competition for one in the last couple years, which, looking back, is quite a lot of bragging rights to be able to hold over a lot of the other members' heads. So to finish the year off, this was his final roster starting in the Super Bowl. Tom Brady had an excellent season. This was the year that he came back 28-3 MVP in the Super Bowl against the Falcons, so he was in the middle of his prime. Lamar Miller had one of his last decent years. Tim Hightower was filling in for Matt Forte, who was injured at the time of the Super Bowl in our league. Brandon Cooks had one of his first top 10 seasons. Martavis Bryant had a pretty mid-year overall, if I'm being honest, but, he got the job done at wide receiver too. AJ Green had one of his last top 5 seasons in fantasy. Big year for him at wide receiver 3 for Mike. Gronk was the number 1 tight end for most of this decade whenever he was on the field, so that was a powerhouse at tight end. And Will Tye was filling in for Alshon Jeffrey and Frank Gore and some others who are on Mike's bench that rotated in at flex. So pretty underdog roster in the grand scheme with some hidden gems here or there, but Mike scrapped it together for the win. And that shows all it takes in fantasy football to get a ring is playing the right players at the right time and making the right moves on the waiver wire. So moving on to the 2016 season, there's already off the bat, you could see some noticeable changes to the standings. We decided as a league that, 8-team leagues are kind of little dick. I mean, everyone always kind of shits on 8-team fantasy football leagues. They're not really, real men play with at least 10 teams, you feel me? So we felt like we ought to bring in 2 other teams. We brought Travis back in for another season, and we also added Team Mark, who was a one-and-done season for Mark, but, he tried. This is also, of course, when Zach officially changed his team name to Meatcock. And what a fitting year to establish his franchise's rebrand with a championship season. Zach finishes out on top with Team Mark at the bottom of the standings at 2-11. And if you notice, I'm ranked 10th with the 6-7 record. That's actually because this was before we actually instilled a league punishment for the loser of the league. We'll get into more detail later about what a punishment means, the purpose that it serves and whatnot, but I will say right off the bat that the point of a league punishment is to motivate the losing teams to keep playing week to week. You see, fantasy football ends every season right around week 14 as far as the regular season of fantasy football. That's when the playoffs start, because you can't do fantasy sports during the actual NFL playoffs. So in order to motivate the losing teams who don't make the playoffs and stop them from dropping all of their players for the teams who are still competing in the playoffs, the point of a league punishment is to give purpose to the losers bracket and give them some sort of negative reinforcement to avoid just throwing their team away for the rest of the year. It also makes it more interesting for everyone else to watch and, peek in on the toilet bowl to see who's going to end up getting punished. But it makes it so that even if you don't make the playoffs, or even if you're starting to have a really rough losing season, you have motivation every single week to not want to end up missing the playoffs and end up losing in the losers bracket. So that's one of the more glaring things to me when I look at these standings is you can clearly see that the teams who didn't make the playoffs had no motivation to keep setting their lineups once week 14 was up. But other than that, this is a pretty impressive win for Zach because this is the first year in the league we have 10 teams. And regardless if these additional 2 teams were going to perform well, we knew that it would make the league much more challenging because when you add more teams, it makes it more difficult to spread talent across all of the rosters because a lot of the top players are getting picked by these new owners as well. So if you ask all of us, we kind of universally agree at this point that 10 teams is the most comfortable, easy, but still challenging enough way to run a fantasy league, and we've been going with that ever since then. Taking a look at Zach's championship winning roster over here, we can see that the league was a pretty damn competitive since Zach had one of the best records at 8-5, meaning that there was a lot of back and forth going on between the teams this year. But Zach finished out with a very solid roster. He has over here Aaron Rodgers, who's just Aaron fucking Rodgers this year. Jordan Howard had a very solid year with the Bears. Ty Montgomery was a rookie and he was decent. I think the most crazy thing about Ty Montgomery is you could have him at wide receiver or running back, which is pretty fucking advantageous sometimes depending on what your need is for your team at the moment. AB was literally the #1 receiver in football this entire decade. Doug Baldwin was solid. Pretty sure he had a top 10 year, finishing with 248 total points, which is just as much as you could ask for out of a wide receiver. This was Taylor Gabriel's rookie year, and he had a pretty decent start off to his career. Cameron Brate used to be a super reliable fantasy tight end back then, and I remember I had him on my team a few times too. He was just very solid at the position, usually could finish top 5 every other year. There's even some more notable players to go on Zach's bench though. He has Brandon Marshall, Lamar Miller, Allen Robinson, Steve Smith Sr., Robbie Anderson, all of which I think, except for Robbie Anderson, all these guys were injured at the time of the playoffs. But definitely a stacked roster from an impressive season that deserves respect in the very first year of 10 teams. And even better for Zach, the Super Bowl was a rematch where he was able to get revenge on Mike for beating him the previous season, also beating him by 1 point, meaning that 2 years in a row, the Super Bowl was decided literally by 1 point, which ended up being further motivation for us to instill decimal points to the league scoring system. Because, I mean, first of all, everyone hates getting ties. It just kind of fucks with the standings. You know, you play to win. You want to win, lose. You know what I mean? And also, various players getting their own decimal points adds up total points to the rest of the team, meaning like beforehand it would be 10 yards for 1 point, you know, receiving or rushing, etc. If you were to get like 4 yards, let's say, or you finish at 54 yards, you'd get 5 points for the 50 yards and no 0.4 points for the extra 4 yards. These scores really add up between a full roster of players going at once, so we made sure to make that change for the next season to avoid any ties and just fully optimize the scoring system to, you know, feel the most fair. And it's the system we still use today in our PPR league. All right, moving on to 2017, and yeah, whoops, I forgot. Mark did stay for another year, but yeah, you know, another 5 and 8 year. Oh well. I mean, at least this season, fuck, bro. Look at Jamie down at the bottom. Now, he changed his team name to Trump Train. I mean, that's whatever, sure. But 1 in 12, holy shit, man. Dude, no, Jamie, this was not your year, bro. If we take a look at Jamie's team, we can see that the reason for this is most of them just got pretty bad injuries. And, you know, it happens. It happens. What can you do? But goddamn, you ever hear of the waiver wire? Like, bro, like at least like make some moves, man. Make some moves. Goddamn roster looking like a modern day B-Mags lineup. Anyways, the reason that I don't have too many memories of this year is because, yeah, I had a pretty rough year in the league, I gotta say. It was definitely an uphill battle from day one for me. Because of that, and because we still didn't have a punishment at the time, I wouldn't set my lineup that often, and I wouldn't check the app too much because I really dropped the ball week 1, bro. It was a mess for me this year. You see, the main problem was that I quite literally drafted my team on LSD, and that turned out to not be the best drafting strategy. It was 2017, it was summer, I was 18 years old, just turned 18, and I decided for the first time I was going to try LSD, and, you know, that just so happened to be on draft night, it turned out. I mean, I don't know, the way that everything was happening at the time, it just, like, I was like, fuck it, whatever, you know, I'll do it, I'll make sure to get the drafting done before the drugs kick in, right, you know? And, well, that worked, you know, I had a lot to look forward to. I had the #1 overall pick this year, so that was pretty cool, you know? So I locked in my first overall pick, which was David Johnson. He was the consensus #1 overall that year. He was just coming off a season where he had dropped nearly 400 fantasy points in the whole year. So, you know, the big year expected out of him. So that wasn't so bad. I pretty much nailed it with that pick. But yeah, by the time the second round hit, I was not coherent enough to do anything. So I ended up just auto-drafting the rest of my draft, which is tragic because, as you know, auto-draft isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's, you know, it's never what you want it to be. If we take a look at who I ended the year with, you know, I mean, there's some bright spots here. Let's like Michael Thomas, I had him his rookie year. I had Larry Fitzgerald, who was still decent at this point in his career. Stupid auto draft, though, drafted me Jordan Reed, who is just an injury machine. Dude barely ever played for me and pretty much got hurt in every game that he did play for me. But most tragic of all, my #1 overall pick, David Johnson, week 1, season-ending injury. Just absolute tragedy on my roster at the start of the season to go with the auto draft, and it's like, you know, you just hate to see it. Although most notable of all, too, I did manage to pick up Alvin Kamara his rookie year off waivers, and he went absolutely bonkers with 307 points, just undrafted from all fantasy drafts, which is awesome. Taking a look back at the standings, though, we could see that this is the first official year under the Peacock name, the name that Mags currently holds to this day. This would be Mags' first championship season, and the very last season to be played without decimal points, making this the 3rd straight Super Bowl in 3 years, decided by 1 point. Zach and Mags tied in the standings at 10-3, so it was a notably still strong season for Zach. However, Mags would end up on top at the end with his first ring, and this was the team that got him there. Now, going down the list here, this was not Cam Newton's MVP season, but this is one of his last few years as a top 5 QB, so solid option there. This was Le'Veon Bell's last really strong year with the Steelers. Jay Ajayi seems like he was here to fill in for Matt Forte, who was stashed on the bench. Jay Ajayi was kind of more of like a, I don't know, kind of a one-hit, 2-year wonder, if you ask me. D-Hop was fucking D-Hop this year, 303 points. Stephon Diggs had a very decent first few seasons or so, just about hitting 200 points this year. Robert Woods was just starting to become more of a fantasy football factor. Travis Kelce was pretty much establishing himself as the #1 dominant tight end in the league at this point. And Golden Tate was pretty money when he was on the Lions, if you ask me, and Stafford was throwing him the ball. So overall, with Doug Martin, Matt Forte on the bench, this is probably one of Mags' strongest and most put-together rosters he's ever had before. And now it's time to move on to one of the single greatest seasons in league history that we've ever seen. The year is 2018, going into our sophomore year of college, and this is the year where I get to win my first ring. We decided we were officially going to part ways with Mark and Travis for good. They have not been in the league since. And in came my brother for a couple seasons, and Graham for the first time, who is now a current member still to this day. My brother decided to call his team Lil Yachty because, I don't know, I mean, he just liked Lil Yachty. Whatever. And Graham's very first team name was the Chimps. Now, Graham, like all of us league members, has also been good friends with all of us throughout the years, and he's been in several other fantasy leagues as well, so he's a relatively competitive person to be adding to this league. Now, I joke around about how this is the greatest season in history of the league, yada, 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 but if anything I'm about to say is no bullshit, it's this might have been the most successful draft in league history. Now, I had a bonkers stacked team this year, just ridiculously overstacked. And most of my starting lineup throughout the season was with me day one from the draft, right out of draft day. So going down the list, I don't remember what pick I had, but it definitely wasn't first overall because I left the first round with Saquon Barkley, who was a rookie and managed to drop nearly 400 points as a rookie. He was just an absolute stud his first year in the league at running back 1 for me. And I mean, he couldn't miss this year. He was unstoppable. And then in the second round, I picked up Michael Thomas, who ended up being the #1 receiver at the end of the year with 307 points, absolute monster season. And in the third round, I took Joe Mixon as my running back 2, who had a very just straight, solid, consistent year at 233 points at the end of the season. Mixon was the kind of guy who could most of the time cover around 20 points, sometimes have a big game close to 30 points. Then at wide receiver, I also had Juju Smith-Schuster, who had his best year as a pro by far, dropping 290 points at the end of the season. This was his last year as the wide receiver 2 next to Antonio Brown in his lineup at the Steelers. And it's the last time he's really been a top receiving threat in the NFL, or considered one. And losing Antonio Brown on his team is one of the worst things that's happened to his fantasy football legacy, I'll tell you that. But this year, he was the 7th overall receiver. And then I also had Tyler Boyd, who was flashing the year before, and then had a breakout season this year before ending his year with an injury on my bench. With Jimmy Graham out of the draft, swapped out with Evan Ingram between injuries with the both of them. And then Julian Edelman was my flex coming out of the draft, who, despite getting injured this season, still produced at a top level whenever he was on the field. And even to go with it, I had a top 3 defense with the Texans and the #1 overall kicker with Will Lutz. But the absolute icing on the cake came with the one trade I made all season. I went all season making one single trade. So Mike, who had recently changed his name to I Love Your TDs, he drafted Tom Brady, and he wanted to stick with Brady through the rest of the season because he was a huge Patriots fanboy, huge Tom Brady fanboy. He just wanted to start Brady and watch Brady play. But he managed to snag Patrick Mahomes off the waiver wire, who was an unproven first-year starter, but was leading the position at QB for fantasy. And he was on a hot streak where he was dropping like 28, 30-something points in the first just 3 weeks of the season. So a lot of people were skeptical if he was going to be able to keep all this up because he had never been a starter before, and Mike was one of those people, so he was looking to shop him out as quick as he could to get some value. Because Mike was worried that if Mahomes started underperforming, nobody would want him, and it's really difficult to trade a QB for some decent value. So my only trade of the season was we worked out a deal where I would give Mike Dion Lewis, Philip Lindsay, and Larry Fitzgerald, and I would get Patrick Mahomes, who I decided to pick as my starting QB for the rest of the season. That bet really paid off for me because Mahomes ended up being one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy football history. Dude dropped 517 points in his first year as a starter, second year in the NFL. 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns. That's just absolutely absurd, and I don't know if you'll ever see that out of a quarterback's first season starting. So in the end, going down the line, I had the number 1 quarterback, the number 1 running back, the number 4 running back, the number 1 receiver, the number 7 receiver, and then 2 guys who flirt with the top 10 in Julian Edelman and Tyler Boyd, with a couple of consistent double-digit tight ends I swapped out. Looking back at all the teams over the years, like I've been doing to prepare for this video, this actually might be one of the most stacked teams in league history to compete with BBQ's team from 2015 and some of the other teams we're about to show you down the line here. After not making the playoffs since my first year in the league, and after having the absolute bumfuck of a season the year before this, my team had the chip on the shoulder, everything to prove, everything to gain, and we pulled it off, running the table in the playoffs to beat the commish in the Super Bowl, 169 to 137. Earning my team its first championship in our league. However, the 2019 season wasn't quite as magical, at least not for my team, because, we hit the big ol' Super Bowl slump, the next year. I was the typical lottery winner who goes broke in less than a year. It was pretty tragic, a really rough sight to see. To see my team fall so high from grace, so hard all the way down to rock bottom, it was ugly. It was ugly. For starters, when we take a look at the standings, we could see some notable name changes, like Mike changed his team name to Big Ass Choppa Make God Win. Jamie changed his name to Comeback Season. By the look of the 6-7 record, seems as though it was not, in fact, comeback season. And oh yeah, my brother happened to change his name, and I don't think he was planning on changing his name going into this season, but after week 1, it was probably necessary. Yeah, my team's hopes, dreams, and expectations were absolutely just crushed and demolished, chewed up, and spit out on week 1 by my younger brother. It was an ugly sight to witness, and to this day, it is the single highest scoring week in our entire league's history. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, week 1, all of my brother's players decided to have like near career level games. Fucking Sammy Watkins dropped like 40 points. Like Sammy Watkins, week 1 of all people. Week 1 warrior Sammy Watkins drops 46.8 points week 1, does fucking nothing the rest of the year. Give me a break. It was a tragedy. Absolute nightmare scenario for my squad week 1, getting alphaed by my brother in front of all of my friends. Although my team was a wash this season, this year ended up being a defining moment for the Peacock franchise. After an impressive 10-3 season, Mags made it to the playoffs and managed to beat Zach 131 to 109 for his second championship, meaning that at one point in time, Mags had the most rings in our league and was the alpha to all of us. It was a dark time indeed. However, Mags's franchise would ultimately go down a similar road to the Cowboys because this new season in 2020, it's a new decade. And Mags to this day, since the end of the 2010s, has not been able to pull himself out of his current slump. We'll go more into detail about how the Peacock legacy has taken a massive nosedive since the turn of the decade. And although Mags' team would miss the playoffs this year and not get back to the playoffs since 2019, the bigger story is arguably to be found at the bottom of the standings between myself and Jamie's new team named the Cleveland Steamers. You see, Jamie had a pesky habit of totally quitting and giving up on his year and not setting his lineup whenever he got off to a bad start to the season. And I had started to develop some of these habits as well after my Super Bowl slump. So after years of talking about it, we finally decided that this was the year we were going to instill a league punishment. Now, the way that this is supposed to work is every team that doesn't make the playoffs is then thrown into a separate tournament where they have to all play each other, and the loser of all of the losers is supposed to be the one who gets punished and comes in last. That's how we do things now, and that's the way that I was trying to explain to everyone we should be doing it this season as well. However, at this time, for whatever reason, the commissioner and some of the other owners in the league decided that what they wanted to do was make the first round of the losers bracket the toilet bowl, meaning that myself and Jamie playing each other in the first round, we both have the 2 worst records in the standings. 1 game, win it all, no tournament, no 3 rounds, just all of it decided week 14. Now, I thought this was stupid. I thought that it was just supposed to be a big tournament between all the people who didn't make the playoffs. But all year, most of the league members were under the impression that the standings were going to determine the punishment. So after they felt safe not being at the bottom of the standings, they really weren't willing to give that up, and everyone was kind of expecting me to have the punishment because I had the worst record for most of the year. Everyone thought that it was just like the worst record gets punished, but I was trying to show them how that's not supposed to be the case because Jamie was still not trying and not setting his lineup because he thought he was safe from a punishment. And that ultimately is the point of a punishment. A punishment is a deterrence. It's a reason for everybody to be motivated to keep trying, because if you suddenly feel like that you're safe from a punishment, but you know you're not going to win at all, what motivation do you have to actually be invested in the league? So sorry for the confusing explanation there, but pretty much a couple weeks before the start of the playoffs, Jamie was informed that he was going to have to actually play to avoid getting punished. And he tried his best, like myself, to pull his shit together for the last game of the year. Because like I said, most of the year, everyone was expecting me to be at the bottom of the standings, and they were expecting the bottom of the standings to be the one who gets punished. So the punishment at the time was the loser has to shave their head. See, my friends are super jealous of my luscious locks that are way prettier and sexier than anything they'll ever have on their head. And they wanted to just see the end of it. They wanted to see me cry and suffer. They were like, yes, we can finally get Bumba to get a haircut. But now that one final game had to be played to determine the ultimate loser, Jamie was now at risk of needing to shave his head. And in the end, this all resulted in the 2020 Toilet Bowl being possibly the single most electric matchup in the history of our league. So the story goes like this. It was Monday night, and Jamie's entire team had already played over the weekend. I was down in the toilet bowl, and I only had Kareem Hunt and Jarvis Landry left. I needed both of them to combine for about 41 points, which was asking a lot because they weren't really having their best seasons, the both of them. Turns out the Browns would end up in a shootout game with the Ravens where both teams were scoring over 40 points by the end of it. Kareem Hunt only had a couple big games this year, and this night, for whatever reason, he decided to take the Browns and carry them on his back. Jarvis Landry had gotten me an okay 11 points, but it was Kareem who was cruising right above 20 points and going strong into the fourth quarter. Everyone was in our group chat texting and watching as I was just a few points away from Jamie. Kareem Hunt scored a massive 20-yard touchdown, and I only needed a couple more catches or yards out of him to just barely inch out Jamie and avoid shaving my head. And the most crazy part of all of this is at the very end of the game had ended and was finished, and I was still down 0.98 points. Everyone had thought that my team choked and I was gonna lose the toilet bowl and have to shave my head over 0.98 points. But it felt weird to me because I was watching every single play and counting every single yard, and it just didn't add up for a second to me. I thought that there needed to be a stat correction, which is pretty common. Every week or so, you know, they get some stats a little bit wrong or a little off here and there, and they quickly correct them to make sure that it's adjusted for the proper score. And by dumb luck or whatever it was, immediately after the game, there was a stat correction issued for Kareem Hunt, giving him just barely enough points to cover my win over Jamie. Everyone was freaking out in our group chat because in the end, I was able to beat Jamie in the first ever toilet bowl punishment game by just 0.2 or 0.3 points off of a stat correction at the very last second in the game. It came down to literally the very last play on Monday night, and these are the kind of moments in fantasy football everyone's looking for. And since we're starting at the bottom and working our way up here, let's get around to talking about the Peacock. Why has Mags found himself in a Super Bowl slump immediately after winning it all? And why has he not been able to break out of it to this day? Now, one thing that I hope you'll come to understand is that every league is like this, but everyone has their own personalities and patterns and behaviors with the way that they manage their franchise. See, some players like myself are very conservative and make very few trades per year. Some teams are more active on the waiver wire than others. Some teams trade more than others. But when it comes to B-Mags, he makes a lot of trades, and he is quite the tinkerer with his lineup. Mags is the type of owner to start the season with one team coming out of the draft and finish with a completely different other team. And sometimes it's worked out in his favor, and he's made some decent moves. However, this season, looking at the transaction history, we could see the beginning phases of what his future behavior would unleash upon the transaction history. We got Mags over here making a whopping 10 trades this season. 10 trades, resulting nearly in every single starting player from week 1 being completely replaced in favor of another. And I can't even go back and check preseason trades. That's where Mags would do the bulk of his work, you know? Before week 1 can even start, Mags was always trying to make some kind of move before the season even kicked off. And other owners are like this too, and it works out and doesn't for everybody. It's, you know, a very risky situation making trades at any time of year. But this is behavior from B-Mags you should start to expect when we take a look at the later seasons and then this current year. It might blow your mind this year, the moves that have been made. Taking a look back at the standings, though, it's about time I explain that my brother and Mike had left the league at this point in time and were replaced by Connor's team, Bluestown Jimmy Bez Band, and Jim's team, Stevie B. Jim's team being a reference to Steve Buscemi. Connor and Jim have both been good friends with us for a very long time, growing up in the same town as us. And despite being really close with us over the years, they both never really followed the NFL as closely as we all did. So adding them to the league was for the sake of making it more fun and getting to share the experience with them. But these two guys, Jim and Connor, were first-year owners, and both didn't do so bad considering. In fact, Jim's team was able to upset Jack within the first round of the playoffs this season, further adding to the commissioner's long list of chokes in big games. And Jim managed to pull it all off despite barely making any trades or waiver wire moves all season. He honestly had absolutely no clue what he was doing, or how much of a bragging right big deal this is to have over the commissioner's head. And that's the worst, isn't it, in fantasy football, getting beat by someone who you know doesn't even know what the hell they're up to. As far as the rest of the playoffs go, Graham had a very strong season, finishing at 10-3. After changing his name to Morning Woodhead, honoring Danny Woodhead, the PPR legend, and putting up numbers in the regular season, Graham was going into the Super Bowl very strong, but it was Zach making it back to another Super Bowl who would edge him out 201 points to 161 in a very high-scoring Super Bowl this season. Two very great rosters going at it. Some notable players: Alvin Kamara, the number 1 running back; D-Hop, the number 4 receiver; Tyreek Hill, the number 2 receiver; Logan Thomas, a top 5 tight end; Travis Kelce, number 1 tight end; Antonio Brown's first year in Tampa Bay with Tom Brady; Justin Jefferson during his rookie season; Jonathan Taylor before his breakout year; and Patrick Mahomes being Patrick fucking Mahomes this season as usual. Graham's defense also putting up a mean 20 points in the Super Bowl, but it wasn't enough to cover over Zach's team. And Zach's team as well, also having some very notable players on his bench in Keenan Allen, Justin Herbert, Christian McCaffrey, Mark Andrews, T. Higgins, all current day studs in fantasy football. It is possible to say that when fully healthy, this roster Zach had assembled might have been one of the best teams ever in the league history. However, McCaffrey would only play 2 or 3 games this entire season. Mark Andrews wasn't quite the Mark fucking Andrews he is today, and Justin Herbert as well, this being his rookie year. Despite all that, these players, even on the bench, would be solid starters in today's lineups, showing that Zach was ahead of the curve, and that was what it took for him to pull off an impressive win, being his 2nd ever championship. Meaning that currently in our storyline here, going into last season, Mags and Zach had 2 rings, myself with 1 ring, and Mike with the only other ring in our league going into the 2021 season. No one else in our entire league had ever won a ring yet going into last year's season. And it would stay this way to this very day, because last season was my year to win it all again. And I did so in extremely dramatic fashion for a come-from-behind, turnaround season, storybook win after everyone counted me out just week 4 this season. But before we get to my championship run from 0-4 to Super Bowl champion, let's start at the bottom of the standings and work our way up like we've been doing so far. Now, what you might have noticed right off the bat, if you've got a keen eye, is that there is no longer Jamie's team included in these standings. And this is because after getting upset by myself in the toilet bowl, Jamie absolutely refused to shave his head or accept any other punishment, which meant that if he wasn't going to uphold the league punishment, he would have to be removed from the league until further notice. Which brings us to our latest addition to the standings, ya mother's gooch. This would be Shane's first year in our league, which he is still a current member to this day. Shane was myself and BBQ's friend from college when we went to Westfield State together, and after joining the league initially to replace Jamie, all of us members have enjoyed his company here, and he's still to this day a member that we intend to keep for a while.
No way.
Or at least as long as he would like to stay with us. But enough with the jumping around all over the place. Let's start at the beginning of this season and work our way to the end. After nearly an entire decade of racking up some impressive wins during the regular season, but failing to show up in the games that mattered the most, the stress of being a beta male in his own league was getting to him, and his hairline started to quit as he announced the picks for last year's draft order.
What is it? With the sixth pick?
Don't look.
I'm not looking.
It's gonna be Shano, the recorder.
Shut the fuck up, Mags.
With the seventh pick in the 2021 19 eyebrows.
Bumba, you're homeless.
Bumba,
Ryan, I miss you.
Homeless 19 eyebrows
all
draft.
right, no, you gotta shake it up more. Here we
YouTube
go.
page sucks.
With the 9th pick,
In the 2021 19 eyebrows fantasy football league.
the commissioner selects.
Don't look. It's not the commissioner. It's the defending champion.
I apologize for that.
2-time.
Jacques Monahan. Pick 9.
9 sucks.
Jacques.
Yes, the commish landed himself with only the 9th pick, but the draft wasn't really super notable. It was, at the end of the day, the crazy amount of trades that were made preseason before week 1 even started. And this is where we will really start to see the Peacock franchise crumble into the joke that it has become today. Now, this is Mag week 1 last year, and I can't actually show you how his team looked preseason, but for starters, coming out of the draft, you can see on his bench he has Jerry Jeudy and Michael Thomas, who he both drafted relatively high given that they were coming into this season with injuries off the bat. Now, Mags was really hoping to stash these players and that they would perform at a top level once healthy, but that turned into a nightmare where in reality he was just carrying them for most of the season and nobody ever really wanted to trade for them. And at least in the case of Michael Thomas, he would never even play once this season, despite riding Mags's bench and taking up a roster spot the entire year. But it would be Mags's preseason trades before week 1 that would really dig him into the hole that he was stuck in for the entire season. For starters, Mags drafted Tyreek Hill in the first round at 8th overall. And before a single snap of football was even played in 2021, Mags immediately traded his first round draft pick to the commissioner. All he got in return for his first round draft pick was A.J. Dillon, David Montgomery, and Chase Claypool. All three of these players, Montgomery, Dillon, and Claypool, would underperform this season, and each of them would get injured this season at least once, if not multiple times apiece. He was catching a lot of shit in our group chat, and the pressure was getting to him. He was starting to panic and have regrets about his decisions just off the bat already. But he would double down and make an even worse move when he traded his 3rd round pick Terry McLaurin and his 4th round pick DeAndre Swift to Graham's team in exchange for Tyler Boyd and Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders would underperform drastically this season. Meanwhile, Swift and Terry McLaurin were both top players at their respective positions for the entire year. And just after week 1, Mags would trade Miles Sanders for Tyler Lockett, netting him significantly less value than what he started with. Mags would leave the 2021 draft with this team, and by week 3 of the regular season, his team was already beginning to just look like this. A massive mismanagement of players before the season can even begin that goes down in history as some of the worst trades made before the start of a season. And as the season went on, literally every single one of Mags's players that would ever fall on his team ended up with an injury at least once or twice, and some of them being very serious injuries that lasted the majority of the year, which resulted in the name change which Mags kept for the entirety of last season fill up the infirmary. But as tragic as Mags' start to this season was, it probably wasn't any of the worst moves made in the offseason altogether necessarily. You see, BBQ's team was a powerhouse this season. He had a really successful draft, and by the end of the year, nearly every single one of his starting players was ranked in the top 10. Notably, he landed Jonathan Taylor, who ended the year as the #1 running back, Justin Jefferson, who had an explosive second year of his career, Deontay Johnson, who was a consistent double-digit targets every week, and Deebo Samuel, who finished in the top 5 as a receiver this season. But tragically, the single best player that BVQ would draft was traded away from his team before week 1. After drafting Cooper Kupp in the 8th round, BBQ would trade Kupp to Zach's team for Damian Harris and Jarvis Landry. And as most of us know by now, Cooper Kupp finished this season with a record-breaking year where he dropped nearly 20 to 30 points every single week consistently. It was one of the best seasons by a fantasy wide receiver ever recorded. And if BBQ had managed to keep Cooper Kupp along with the really successful draft that he had, there is no doubt BBQ would have gone undefeated and won it all at the end of the season. But as we all know by now, there was a pesky little 0-4 team who had something to say about it by the end of the year. Entering week 5, my team was off to an extremely slow start this season and was only managing to average just around 120 points a game. Everyone was giving me shit for it, and I was the laughingstock of the entire league at the time. Now, I hadn't made any trades yet all season because I genuinely liked the players that I had on my team, and I believed in them for the long run. Literally the night before week 5, Zach was in Discord with me, screaming at me that I needed to be making some sort of trade, some sort of move. He thought that I was extremely stubborn and belligerent, acting like I was gonna win it all even though that there was no evidence to prove it. Now, I was watching my guys, and I didn't want to part ways with any of them, and I told Zach that I wasn't gonna make any moves, and I was gonna believe in my squad. He threw his hands up and was done with me, but then week 5 came around, and my team would go on to put up the biggest week of the season at the time, dropping 208 points. I hadn't made a single move, and suddenly almost all of my starters were being ranked in the top 10, and everyone was impressed with my team out of nowhere. Now, my late round draft choice, Jamar Chase, who was having one of the greatest rookie seasons ever by the end of the year, would be a huge help in all of this. But as the season moved on, I made some good moves on the waiver wire and made 2 very specific trades that ended up helping me big time in the end. I was able to trade Aaron Jones, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and T. Higgins to Zach's team for Austin Eckler, who finished the year as the #2 running back. And then Graham offered me a trade for DeAndre Hopkins and Dawson Knox for George Kittle and Cordero Patterson, who ended up finishing the year as the top 5 running back. And on top of all this, my 9th round draft pick, Leonard Fournette, would begin to win his starting job at Tampa Bay and start going absolutely off, producing at a top 5 level week to week before getting hurt going into the fantasy football playoffs. Suddenly, my team was a powerhouse that could compete with BBQs, and we went on a win streak where we only lost 1 game the rest of the year, making the playoffs as the #3 seed. And after winning the wild card round, I made it to the semifinals where I beat Zach to advance to the Super Bowl against BBQ. After winning a playoff game for his first time in his entire history with the league, BBQ's dreams of a championship were crushed when Jamar Chase dropped me 55 points on his ass in our Super Bowl matchup, carrying my team to a victory 163 to 147. It was a glorious comeback of a season for a title run, and it just goes to show you that record doesn't matter at all in fantasy football. All that matters is who's playing this week and who puts up numbers. More than anything, I want this season to show anyone else who's playing fantasy football that if you make the right moves on the waiver and you make some decent trades, then anything could happen, and you should never give up or throw away a season. And speaking of throwaway seasons, if you ask me, the more entertaining game to be found at this time of year would be seen at the bottom of the standings in the toilet bowl. Despite being the fan favorite to lose the toilet bowl, Mags would actually squeak away with a win, saving him from any further punishment. Jason and Shane both won their respective matches in the first round, leaving Connor to face off with Mags, where he would end up losing, making Connor the second franchise ever to be subjected to a league punishment. It was certainly a wild ride all season, and most of us were expecting Mags to end up losing in the end, but Despite all of his panicking and constant anxiety about his team, he did manage to pull it together. However, we're going to finish this video off right now by catching you guys up on what's going on with the league right now to this current day. And it's definitely not looking so great for Mags this season either already. So when we look over here at this year's standings, you guys can see that Jamie is back in the league officially and at the top of the standings currently with his team No Connie Johnny. You see, Jim wanted to part ways with our league because he is just not that interested in NFL football, fantasy football, etc. And we told Jamie that he could come back in the league to fill his spot under one condition, and that was that he fulfill his punishment from the previous year, making this probably the only year where 2 teams in total were being punished at once. So the punishment we had decided on for Connor was that he was going to have to wear a dress in public with us to go see a Red Sox game. We figured, why not kill 2 birds with 1 stone and throw Jamie in there with him, make Jamie wear a dress with us to the game. And I gotta say, you know, it's not quite as hardcore as shaving the loser's head, but I mean, it's a start and not so bad. It was quite enjoyable for our first ever league punishment. Best part is that Jamie's tits actually fit like perfectly into the dress. I mean, you would have thought that he needed a bra. We also sat behind someone's bachelorette party and BBQ actually threw up on the bride. Yes, that was a thing that happened. This season though, we're contemplating signing Mags up for skydiving and throwing him out of an airplane while he wears a dress. But now I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We're very early into this year's season, only currently at week 4 in the NFL season. And there hasn't been too many trades this year early on because, I mean, I guess everyone's a little scared after the way that the preseason trades went last season. No one was really sure what they were getting. But don't you count out the peacock, because if you're looking for some entertaining trades, you can always find them over at Mags's team. Now, believe it or not, he managed to control himself up until the end of week 1 and didn't trade anyone in the preseason this year. This was the team he left the draft with. I'd say the most notable thing is on his bench. You can see DeAndre Hopkins, who was suspended before the start of this season. Mags is already trying to pull what he pulled the previous year with Michael Thomas, who wasn't playing at the start of the year. However, it is a slight improvement over that whole ordeal because D-Hop is not injured as far as anyone knows. He is just suspended. Though wasting a pick to reach for D-Hop late is definitely noteworthy. Also, he drafted Alexander Madison, hoping and wishing injury upon Dalvin Cook. I believe also at the draft, when he took Madison, he looked over at BBQ with a smug look on his face and said, "We'll be in talks." Over here, this is Mag's team week 2, and you can already see that the bad luck from last season is starting to carry over into this season as well. On the bench, you could see Keenan Allen out with injury, Michael Pittman out with injury, Travis Etienne benched because he's garbage, D-Hop still suspended, of course, and Elijah Mitchell sitting on the IR spot with a long-term injury. All of this coming after a rough loss week 1. Mags was panicking in week 2. And that's why you can see Juju Smith-Schuster in his lineup now. Before the start of the week 2 games, Mags made a trade with Graham where he offered up Drake London, Rashad Bateman, and the handcuff to Graham's running back. This trade was laughed at and mocked by the other league members. And when it came time to play in week 2, Juju Smith-Schuster had only put up 4 points, while the players Mags had just traded, Rashad Bateman and Drake London, would both go on to score over 20 points each apiece. Mags gave up on rookie Drake London after just 1 week and didn't believe in Rashad Bateman. But I think it's safe to say right now the Juju Smith-Schuster trade has yet to be a profitable move for the Peacock franchise. Then after another rough loss in week 2, Mags was going into week 3 with Dalton Schultz out with injury. Mike Evans had gotten suspended for his fight with Marshawn Lattimore in week 2. And the only player he was able to return from injury so far is Michael Pittman, which is resulting in a revolving door at every position on Mags's team currently. He managed to trade D-Hop with Jamie for AJ Dillon, and this is where his team currently sits today. After catching a lot of shit for not having a winning season since the 2020s began, this prompted the week 2 name change from Philip the Peacock to 0-2 rings. Mags may currently be in a slump, but he doesn't want anyone to forget that he has 2 rings. And outside of myself and Zach, No one else in the league has any ring. But as we all know, there's still a lot of football to be played, and anything can happen over the course of a long season. Which is why you guys can check back here week to week, and I'll be sure to keeping you up to date on all of the big moves, big trades, and big trash talk that's going on between the owners this season every single week. We're also going to have weekly interviews with each of the owners of the league, and you guys can get a little more insight to who they are and what they're about and what their plans are for this coming season. And hopefully you guys will find things that you like about each of our members of the league. And you can follow along and root for your favorite owner as the season comes to an apex towards the end. These are the current standings as they are. Jamie and Brian are currently at the top undefeated with 3 wins. Myself, Zach, and Connor sitting in the middle with 2 wins. Graham, the commissioner, and Jason with 1 win. And Shane and Mags 0-3 at the bottom. Although it is fair to say that everyone has had different schedules right now, and there's no telling exactly who is going to stick around for the long haul. I wasn't able to go in too much detail over every little thing that's happened in the last decade because, you know, there's just so much to be mentioning. But from here on out, I'm going to be documenting every big thing that goes on in our league week to week. So eventually you guys are going to be able to have a deeper understanding of what's actually going on in detail for hopefully decades to come, because we don't really plan on stopping this anytime soon. For those of you who understand, fantasy football is kind of a way of life. It's one of the most exciting things on the planet, and it goes perfectly paired with Red Zone. Maybe you're already into fantasy football, maybe you aren't, but hopefully you'll be able to find some entertainment out of the drama that goes on within our league. Be sure to check back for more. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the history of 19 Eyebrows. I'm going to leave this video off showing you guys screenshots of our spreadsheet we have that keeps track of every owner's career statistics. Thank you all again, and I hope to see you guys back enjoying some 19 Eyebrows football with us.